So I look at micro brands a lot on this channel, and I want to sort of get a feel for some of the bigger ones that I haven't reviewed before. And so today we're going to be taking a look at Baltic Watches. I asked them to send over 2 watches that kind of, I felt, represent what Baltic is all about. We're going to check those out and try and answer the question, is Baltic any good? Take a quick look and then we'll get into it. Hey guys, this is Dave. Welcome back to my channel, Just the Watch, where I like to look at affordable watches, whatever that means these days. As always, I am broadcasting from my home in Iwate, Japan. And today we're looking at Baltic Watches, which is, I think, one of the most important micro brands out there. I find it interesting that they tend to get a lot of attention from watch outlets that typically cover luxury watches. So, well, for me, I would typically consider their watches something of a premium in the price range that I normally look at. Again, compared to the luxury watch space, they're incredibly affordable. Both of the watches that we're looking at today come in at just under $600, and today we'll be looking at what you get for that money. There's a number of things that I find interesting about Baltic. For one, they're based out of France, which is uncommon. We don't see a lot of manufacturers coming from France these days. They're also very transparent about how they make their watches. The individual parts for the watches are primarily produced in Hong Kong. The movements they're sourcing from either China or from Japan for the most part. But they have all of those components shipped to France where they do the assembly and adjustment and testing and quality control themselves. And this gives them a lot more control over the end product that actually gets shipped out from them to the customers. It also makes them a lot more capable in servicing the watches after they've been sold. So I think you're going to get a higher level of support from Baltic, and especially when you talk about using some of the interesting movements that they do, like the micro-rotor movement in the MR Classic that we're going to be looking at in just a minute. The fact that they can support these movements themselves is a big deal. Now, as mentioned, I have 2 watches from Baltic that we're going to be taking a look at that I think gives a pretty good impression and overview of what Baltic offers. We're going to be looking at their classic dive watch, which is the Aquascaphe, as well as the MR Classic, which is more of a dress watch. 2 very different watches, but together I think gives you a good feel for what Baltic is about. Another interesting thing about Baltic is that they make bracelets that are interchangeable across various models. So I have the Aquascaphe on this cool beads of rice bracelet, but that bracelet also fits the MR Classic, the dress watch. So if you buy that one bracelet, you can use it with multiple watches from Baltic, which is pretty cool as well. We'll get into all that in these reviews. Now, Baltic has sent me 2 watches. They agreed to let me keep one of the 2, and that's why you saw the paid promotions flag at the beginning of this video. However, other than the watch itself, I didn't receive any additional compensation, nor did Baltic have any control over the content of this review. So with that out of the way, let's jump into these 2 watches and get a feel for what Baltic is all about, starting with the Aquascaphe. The Aquascaphe is Baltic's dive watch, and this is the watch that really put them on the map, as well as set the stage for all the watches that would follow. It's moderately proportioned with a 39mm diameter, with classic stylings that give it a vintage European flair. But the Aquascaphe is much more than just about looks. This is a full-featured, rugged tool watch that features 200 meters of water resistance, a sapphire crystal, a sapphire bezel insert, and a very solid, reliable Miyota 9000 series movement. And for me, it's this combination of features that makes the Aquascaphe a very appealing watch. Its size and sophisticated style make it suitable for everyday wear, while its high water resistance and rugged components make it fully capable for scuba diving or whatever other extreme things you might do on a daily basis. Today, I'm looking at the classic white version of the Aquascaphe, which features a stark white dial that has a slight sand-like texture to it, with printed markers that are outlined with high-contrast, crisp black lines. Baltic has complemented this dial with a black handset that is highly visible against that white dial, making the watch very easy to read. The simple pencil-shaped hands and geometric markers have a vintage charm about them. Going back to the dial, you have circular markers for the normal hours with triangular tooth-shaped markers at 3, 6, and 9. But rather than going the traditional route and simply putting a large triangle at 12 o'clock, Baltic has instead opted to put the numeral 12 at that place. And while that seems like a very small thing, it actually gives the watch a lot of charm and personality. It's an interesting combination of using traditional dive markers and Arabic numerals. Most of the time, if a dive watch is going to use Arabic numerals, they're going to put them at 12, 3, 6, and 9. So here, Baltic is taking a little bit more of a hybrid approach. Now, if this were a pure tool watch meant for diving, that might not be the best choice. Traditionally, the 12 o'clock marker is the largest and boldest marker on a dive watch, and this is meant to help the diver quickly orient the watch in the dark depths of the ocean. But nobody uses their dive watches for that purpose anymore. And because Baltic has allowed themselves this one small liberty, I think it really does add to the character and personality of the watch. It looks a little bit more fun and a lot more distinct. Moving out to the bezel, we find a similarly clean layout that allows you to track elapsed time. This is a 120-click unidirectional bezel. The action is very tactile and smooth. And just like the crystal, the bezel insert is made out of highly scratch-resistant sapphire. This is also a fully lume bezel that utilizes BGW9 for a nice blue glow in the dark, which matches the lume formulation used on both the hands and the markers. The Aquascaphe features a very healthy application of lume that offers a strong glow in the dark. This is a fully functional level of lume that you would expect to find on a tool watch used for scuba diving. And while a lot of micro brands have recently been pushing the boundaries of lume performance, creating watches that glow much brighter than this one, the lume performance on the Aquascaphe is still matching what Seiko is putting out on some of their current certified dive watches. The case design on the Aquascaphe is rather simple but still elegant. It has a slim profile with subtle curves to the lugs, and while there are no bevels or polished accents, the fully brushed surfaces are excellently finished. I appreciate the inclusion of drilled lugs, a high-quality signed crown, and engraved caseback. The lack of polished surfaces is somewhat made up for by the highly domed sapphire crystal and the matching sapphire bezel insert. These glossy surfaces add a level of flair to the watch, and the slight distortions at the edges of that high domed sapphire crystal further enhance the watch's overall vintage charm. But once again, the Aquascaphe offers a lot more than just good looks. This is a very solid, well-built watch with a full 200 meters of water resistance, a rugged case with a screw-down crown, and as beautiful as those sapphire elements are on the front of the watch, they are also highly scratch-resistant, which makes for a watch that should be able to take anything you can throw at it. Inside, the watch is powered by the reliable Miyota 9039 automatic movement. This is a premium Japanese movement that features a high level of accuracy and a smooth sweeping second hand that ticks 8 times per second. It's reliable, proven, thin, and one of my favorite watch movements in watches in this price range. Speaking of price, this watch comes in at 580 euros from Baltic, which is about $600 US. As a dive watch, that puts it in competition with the likes of Seiko. And while there are a number of lower priced micro brands out there offering similar specifications, there aren't that many that offer this level of sophistication or that do their assembly and adjustment outside of China. For a lot of budget-conscious watch collectors, that $600 might be a bit of a stretch, but the Aquascaphe has developed something of a cult following in the watch community, and in terms of robustness and refined design, it compares very favorably to luxury watches costing 10 times or more. That said, there are a few minor complaints that I have about this watch. Well, I do really like that stark polar dial. Even with the black outlines, the dial markings still offer a lot less contrast than on the black sandwich dial versions of the Aquascaphe, and I think going with either thicker outlines or with applied markers with black bases could have helped that a little bit more. And while I appreciate the simple tool-like aesthetic of the case, I don't think it would have killed them to add some bevels or polished edges to this watch, but I am kind of on the fence there. I think that might have pushed this a little bit further into the dress diver territory, and I really like the balance that Baltic has been able to strike here between the very functional tool watch aesthetic with something a little bit more slim and elegant. The second watch that I asked Baltic to send over to round out my understanding of what they offer is the MR Classic Blue. This is Baltic's dress watch, and while in many ways it couldn't be more different from Baltic's rugged tool watch in the Aquascaphe, the vintage stylings, moderate proportions, and high attention to detail all contribute to make this a watch that fits squarely within Baltic's brand identity. And with this MR Classic in particular, Baltic made a lot of interesting choices that I think really shows that they're not simply following the trends of the watch industry, but that they're actually pushing things forward in terms of design, choices of movement, and materials. It's a bit of a risky move, but it certainly seems to have paid off well for them here. When Baltic released the MR1, rather than comparing it to fashion brands, many were comparing it to high-end luxury brands like Patek Philippe. And this is not only due to the stunning work on the dial and handsets, which features stylized, applied Arabic markers that are intricately crafted, and a beautifully finished leaf-shaped handset, but also to their bold choice of using an unconventional micro-rotor movement. This is what the MR refers to in the name of the watch. A micro-rotor movement, as the name would suggest, is a movement that incorporates a small weighted rotor that fits inside of the movement rather than the typical full-size rotors that tend to sit on top of the movement. The benefits of a micro-rotor movement are that it allows the watch to be made a little bit slimmer, and it allows you to see the movement more clearly without the rotor obscuring it. And obviously Baltic feels like this is a big part of the watch. That's why they named the watch after the movement. And so of course they put an expansive exhibition case back on this watch, allowing you to see the movement in all of its glory. And this is one of the most beautiful watch movements you're going to see in a watch in this price range. Micro-rotor movements are typically only found in extremely high-end luxury watches, and so if you're a watch collector who's interested in mechanical movements, this is a rare opportunity to be able to get one at a relatively affordable price. So how did Baltic do this? How could they squeeze a watch movement that's this impressive looking into a watch that costs less than $600? Well, this is not a boutique Swiss-made in-house movement, but rather an off-the-shelf Chinese movement in the form of the Hangzhou Caliber 5000A micro-rotor movement. Now, there are a lot of Chinese movement manufacturers out there, and there's a lot of different, very interesting Chinese mechanical watch movements that are being produced, and they are of varying degrees of quality. That said, Hangzhou is one of the most reputable movement manufacturers coming out of China, and this Hangzhou micro-rotor movement is one that I have seen used in a number of other micro brands. So it does have a little bit of a track record going for it. The other really important part of this is the Baltic brand themselves. I feel a lot safer ordering a watch with this movement in it from a brand like Baltic rather than from a Chinese factory direct brand or even other smaller micro brands, because at this point Baltic is a fairly mature micro brand that has been around for a while, and they have developed the resources to service and maintain the watches that they sell. This means that if you purchase this watch today and need some help with the movement a few years down the road, Baltic will be there to be able to service it. And that's very important because a micro-rotor movement like this would normally be fairly difficult to get serviced. If you just take it to your local watchmaker, there's a high chance that they wouldn't be able to perform servicing on it because it's such a unique movement. But Baltic not only offers a 2-year warranty on this watch and movement, but they also have the ability to perform service on it after the warranty expires for an additional cost. And so if you happen to be looking to get a watch with a micro-rotor movement, if you're into collecting rare and unusual movements like this, I think this watch from Baltic is probably your best bet on the market right now. And this is an absolutely gorgeous and beautifully finished movement. I never get tired of looking at a watch movement. There's something just so amazing about them to me. Mechanical machines like this are such a rarity in our modern digital age, and I think one of the most fun parts about this hobby is being able to take your watch off your wrist and show it to a friend who's never seen a mechanical watch before and show them how it works. And the movement in here looks way more impressive than anything you're going to find coming out of Seiko or Miyota or even a lot of the entry-level Swiss automatic movement. But in addition to the beauty of the movement, it also serves a practical purpose in allowing the watch to be extremely thin. Including the crystal, this watch is just a sliver under 10 millimeters thin, with the case itself being an impressive 8 millimeters thick. Compared to the case on the Aquascaphe, the MR Classic features a little bit more decoration with a polished surface across the top of the lugs and brushwork along the sides. Once again, you are also getting drilled lugs. However, the crown on the MR Classic is unsigned, and going across the top of the case, you have a flat polished bezel. And rising from that bezel is another daring design choice that Baltic went with. This is not a sapphire crystal, but rather it is made out of hesselite, a kind of acrylic. Hesselite is somewhat well known in the watch community as being the material that the Omega Moonwatch Professional uses as its crystal material. This is an incredibly durable, impact and shatter resistant material that is made out of acrylic, and it was very commonly used on vintage watches from the 1960s. It has some subtle optical qualities that set it apart from modern sapphire or mineral crystals, and watches that feature it often take on just a little bit more of a vintage air. And given that the design of this watch really does harken back to the 1950s and 60s, this hesselite crystal really feels like the right choice for this watch. However, it is still a controversial choice because acrylic like this is extremely prone to developing scratches. And that's the trade-off here. Because this is a softer material, it will absorb impacts much more readily than sapphire and not shatter, but it will pick up dings and scratches in the surface of that very easily. The nice thing about acrylic crystals like this is that can largely be remedied with a little bit of polywatch, which is a polishing compound that can clean up most of the surface scratches that acrylic crystals tend to pick up. And so for me, I actually much prefer an acrylic crystal like this to a mineral crystal. I'm much more comfortable looking at scratches on my watch crystal, knowing that when I feel like it, I can buff those out with a little bit of polywatch and clean it up and get it looking nice again. And there really is something charming to the way these acrylic crystals look. The last thing to mention is probably the thing we should have started with, and that's the size. Once again, Baltic is not following the typical trends. Rather than going with the more modern standard of 38 or 40 millimeters on a dress watch, Baltic went with a much more vintage 36 millimeter diameter. And this is something that's going to further differentiate and divide people about this watch. I'm not used to wearing watches this small, so it looks a little bit undersized to my eye on my 7.5-inch wrist, but that is totally a personal preference thing. Back in the 50s or 60s, it would be completely normal for someone with a wrist my size to wear a watch this size. And now in 2025, the trend seems to be moving back to smaller sized watches. And in that regard, Baltic might be a little bit ahead of the curve here. And so most of the negatives to this watch aren't really straight negatives. They're just controversial choices on the part of Baltic. The negatives are that it's too small, that it uses this weird Chinese movement that's going to be difficult to get serviced, and it has a scratch-prone acrylic crystal. But those exact same things are also this watch's major selling point. So depending on where you fall regarding those issues, this is either going to be a hard pass or it's exactly the watch you've been looking for. Controversial design choices aside, there are two other things that I don't particularly like about this watch. The first is the unsigned crown. I think it looks a little bit plain. I'm not sure why they left it unsigned like that. That's fairly minor though. The other is that the choice of going with 20 millimeter lug openings looks proportionally a little bit off for a 36 millimeter watch like this. 18 or even 19 millimeters is probably the correct size for proportions here, but 20 millimeter watch straps are much easier to find. So even though I think 20 millimeter watch straps look too wide for this watch, it's still nice to be able to have that option to easily switch between different straps. And it fits with Baltic's interesting strategy of making their straps and bracelets interchangeable across their different watches. It's kind of crazy that the metal beads of rice bracelet that fits on the Aquascaphe also fits seamlessly on the lug openings of the MR Classic. This is great if you buy into the whole Baltic ecosystem, because it means that if you buy one bracelet, you can use it across multiple watches. And their beads of rice bracelet is a very high quality and beautiful bracelet that does fit pretty well on both a dress watch and a dive watch. It's definitely a flashy bracelet with its polished center links, but it features a sturdy milled dive style clasp that, while it doesn't feature tool-free micro adjust, which is becoming much more common on micro brand watches, it does feature 6 micro adjust positions, allowing you to get a very custom fit with this bracelet. And it also comes with quick release spring bars, making it very easy to swap this bracelet from one watch to another. And since I really enjoy playing around with different watch straps on my watches, I really appreciate that Baltic has made that kind of a core part of these watches. So hopefully as you've seen these two watches, it gives you something of a feel for what Baltic is all about as a brand. But as always, I'd love for you guys to help me round out my opinion of Baltic watches by dropping a comment down below. Particularly if you own a Baltic watch, I'd love to know your experience with it. And if you're thinking about a Baltic watch, let me know which of the two watches that we looked at today are more appealing to you. I'll leave a link to Baltic's website down below if you want to check it out and purchase one of these watches. Or if you want to get a watch themed t-shirt like this one, you can check it out on my website at justthewatch.com. Also, I just posted a bunch of watches for sale on my website. These are primarily watches that I've reviewed in the past. Most of them have sold out, but there's a few left. I'll leave a link to that down below in the description as well. Anyways, that's going to wrap it up for today. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.